God opens this chapter with these wonderful words. You are the children of the Lord your God. Now, it doesn't say you are the servants of the Lord your God. You are the slaves of the Lord your God. You are the creation of the Lord your God. All those things are true, but listen to the beautiful relational intimacy with which God considers his people. You are the children of the Lord your God. Perhaps you can remember the feeling of being given an instruction by a parent when you were still a child, and you disagreed with it. You didn't see the wisdom of it or the value in it. And now perhaps for some of you watching, you've been on the other side of that table and you often give instructions to your children and you have their best interests at heart, and yet those requests, those commands are viewed with suspicion by them. This is God saying to his people, you're going to get a whole load of commands in this chapter that might not fit well with your intuition or your human wisdom, but I'm asking you as your parent and as your God. I do know best. He says, do not cut yourselves or shave the front of your heads for the dead. Now, I've got to tell you, that particular temptation has never seized me. What is he talking about? Shaving the front of your heads for the dead? Well, he's talking to a particular people in a particular context. They are about to head into Canaanite territory, and these cultures practice identifying themselves in these ways. These identifying marks are bound up with their false religious systems, and God's people are supposed to be different and distinct in the way that they live, even in the way that they grieve, in fact. In the book of 1 Thessalonians, we're reminded that we do not grieve like the rest of mankind. Why? Because we trust the God who is in control of life and death, and we know that all those who hope in the Lord will live, even though they have died. The grieving process still stings for Christians, but it also ought to look different for Christians. For the Canaanites, it's not just about shaving the front of their heads, but cutting themselves. It was commonly believed that self-inflicted pain was a way of capturing the attention of the gods. Do you remember that showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal at the top of Mount Carmel? When the false prophets were unable to force their false gods to respond, do you remember what they did? They shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until the blood flowed. Apparently, this was a requirement from these Canaanite false gods, these demonic deceptions. Just notice how worshipping the one true God is so much more delightful than that. Even in this very chapter, it is spelled out for us. When we talk about tithing towards the end of the chapter, look at verse 26. Remember, this is a command from God for his people. He says, use the silver to buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, or other fermented drink, or anything you wish. Then you and your household shall eat there in the presence of the Lord your God and rejoice. That is how God commands his people to worship him. Share meals, swap stories, have fun, enjoy good food with your family, and worship the living God together. You see why it is important that false worship is stamped out like a cancer that must be cut out of the body. There must be no mercy for these Canaanites because of their detestable practices. God goes on to list out clean and unclean animals. And again, these kind of dietary laws serve several purposes. Firstly, they prevent a kind of easy fellowship with this Canaanite culture. And again, the whole point is that they stay separate. They are a holy people, literally set apart in verse 2. And therefore, they must not eat these detestable things from verse 3 onwards. Now, in the years since these scriptures have been written, lots of work has gone into trying to understand the mind of God on this issue. And many people will tell you that the particular foods that were off limits for the Israelites are the kinds of foods that most often carry bacteria or other dangerous diseases. I think there's probably some mileage in that. But for the Israelites, it's important that they obey simply out of their trust for God. And they trust God because he's their father. Whether or not they see the value in these particular prescriptions is of secondary value. It is for their good that they obey. And the same is true for that final section, the importance of tithing, giving a tenth of all that the fields produce each year. An annual reminder, of course, that God is the one who gives. Our crops, our resources, our lives are in His hands. We ought to be generous towards others because He has been generous towards us. That principle of tithing, giving, being a generous person extends to loving, practically loving, and looking after the Levites who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners and the fatherless and the widows. They ought to be able to come into your towns and not just eat, but eat and be satisfied. And in this way too, God's people set themselves apart from the Canaanites. We ought to love one another as we ourselves have been loved by God.